Let's talk about Xi and Biden. What would be your take on them and their meeting?
Well, it was a really interesting announcement Thursday, Wednesday night, I guess it was, that Mr. Biden and Mr. Xi are going to get together at the meeting in Bali, in Indonesia. The way that Mr. Biden dismissed the notion that Xi is, as Xi has said, Biden, not Biden's, but Putin's best friend. uh, they've met something like 28 times over the past few years, physically or by Zoom. They're very close. As a matter of fact, China and Russia have never been closer in their entire history. And I can speak to that since my first portfolio at the CIA analysis shop was to watch Sino-Soviet relations. This was in the early 60s, and it was clear that they hated each other. They had a big ideological dispute for leadership of the world communist movement, but they also had territorial grievances. China was claiming 1.5 thousand kilometers, square kilometers of Siberia, claiming that the Russians acquired those under unequal treaties going back to the 17th century, Treaty of Nerchinsk. Was that a valid claim? Yeah. Were they unequal treaties? Yeah, they sure as hell were. And the Chinese were pressing that. There was shooting across the riverine border there, the Amur and the Usuri rivers, dividing the two countries. What else? Well, they were actually in such rivalry that when Russia thought it necessary to help Vietnam, I'm talking about North Vietnam, the Vietnamese communists, with some rudimentary supplies, China prevented Russia from doing that, prevented those supplies coming to a socialist ally from going through China. Why? Well, because China didn't want Russia to be able to claim leadership, defender, the big defender of the world communist movement, including communist Vietnam. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that this animus, this contest between two communist countries was of overriding importance. So much so that we ran into a lot of problems with old school troglodytes who said, McGovern, you're getting sucked in here. They're both commies, for God's sake. This is all a sham. They're all making this stuff up to deceive us into thinking that it's real, you know. Well, we didn't have much to go on. One thing we had was that we intercepted radio signals, radio broadcasts from Russia to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. What those radio broadcasts indicate? That the Russians were stirring up trouble, stirring up insurrections in Xinjiang, of course, part of China. Well, that seemed to be real, but that didn't convince these people. They're both commies. Well, then, luckily, we had these satellites that would fly over like once or twice a day, and every now and then they would pick up some photography on the Sino-Soviet border, take it back to Rochester, have it developed. Our analysts go up there, and I got a call from Rochester. Ray, you're going to be happy with our interpretation of what we just photographed. And I said, why? We found 15 advanced Soviet divisions on the Chinese border. Oh, Well, that sort of convinced a couple of people, but not all of them. They all say, well, they're both commies. So the next thing that happened, this is a little vignette here. It's interesting. It shows how intelligence can be used or misused. One of these images, one of the photography pieces that we got was showed a MiG-19 on the apron of the Shenyang in China airframe plant. Now, MiG-19 was pretty advanced in those days. We're talking 1964, 65, around there, okay? MiG-19 was almost state-of-the-art. MiG-21 hadn't even been developed, okay? So these guys came to us, they said, ha, see? If they hate each other, why is Russia giving China a MiG-19? And we said, well, isn't it on the apron of a Chinese airframe plant in Shenyang? Yeah, that's right. Well, maybe the Chinese are making it themselves. And these very, very smart guys said, they can't be making it themselves. And we said, why? Because there's snow on the roof. Oh, you mean, yeah, that's right. If you're making these things, especially in the winter, you're going to have to get heat in there. The Shenyang gets pretty cold, okay? So they can't be making it because there's snow on the roof. So we threw up our hands. Some people you can never convince, right? Well, then 3 years later, we got a Chinese refugee come through our defector center. He was from Shenyang. And guess what? We found out that he worked at that airframe plant. So we asked him, were you there in the early 60s? What do you remember about it? He said, oh, it was awful. We had to wear 3 or 4 overcoats, and it was just terrible because there was no heating in this plant, and we were producing MiG-19s. So, yeah, there you go, Snow on the roof doesn't negate all the other information that we had. That the Russians and the Chinese hated each other. The Russians were not giving China MiG-19s. China was making MiG-19s themselves, okay? And what else? Well, trade between Russia and China back in those days, it was all of $200 million annual trade. Whoa, not much, okay? What is it going to be next year? Would you believe 200 billion? Now, I've done the math, and I had it checked with my mathematician sons. That's 1,000 times. 1,000 times annual trade turnover than was the case back in the 60s. That means something. So we were wrong when we thought that they would hate each other forever because there was a common enemy developing, and that enemy was the United States, the United Kingdom, people who wanted to keep both Russia and China down. Back in April of last year, 2021, Biden all of a sudden asked Putin, well, let's have a summit. I mean, this situation in Ukraine is worrying, it's bothering, let's have a summit. And so they had a summit in Geneva. Now, we don't know much about what happened at that summit, except Biden decided to say things right after the summit that same afternoon. And what he said was this: it's not appropriate for me to talk about what I told Putin, but, China is being squeezed. I'm sorry. Russia is being squeezed by China. There's this long, several thousand-mile border between the two countries. Russia knows that China aspires not only to be the biggest economic giant in the world, but also a military power. Putin's got a lot to worry about. He's being squeezed by China. Well, that was June 16 of last year, 2021. 21. Now, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall after Putin heard that and consulted his advisors and said, huh? Doesn't Biden realize? Don't those advisors that are telling Biden what's up, don't they realize that China and Russia are together in a very, very close embrace? It's not a squeeze. It's a fraternal embrace, okay? No more communist stuff. I mean, China's not communist anymore, let's face it. So why do I mention that? I mention that because after June 16 last year, the Chinese and the Russians did everything they possibly could to try to educate, to try to enlighten Biden to the fact that they were standing together, that they had a virtual alliance. And indeed, on the 15th of December last year, Xi Jinping, the president of China, described their strategic relationship as something that exceeds the normal alliance between two countries. Exceeds, that's the word. Goes farther than, okay? So, what do I mention all that? Well, because there was some question as to whether China would support Russia in Europe. China likes to tend to its own affairs. It's got lots of experience, like 4 or 5 millennia. It doesn't like to get involved in foreign machinations, and so it was highly unusual. It was kind of a real puzzle to see what China might do. Long story short, when Putin saw he was not getting anywhere in trying to persuade the United States, it's usually people say the United States and NATO, but it's really the United States that's calling the shots, so that's what I'll use here. Putin could not persuade the United States that he suffered an existential threat if Ukraine became part of NATO, if U.S. missile bases went into Ukraine, as the holes in Romania and Poland already exist. There could be missiles put in there 5 to 7 to 10 minutes away from Moscow, okay? So what Putin did, he went to Xi up in Beijing at the start of the Olympics. That was the 4th of February this year, 2022. And he said, I'm not getting, no, I don't, this is my reasoning as to how this evolved. He said, Mr. Xi, best friend Xi, the West is not taking me seriously. The U.S. is not negotiating in good faith. Matter of fact, thousands of NATO-trained troops are arrayed against Donetsk and Lugansk. They're about to pounce on those countries after killing maybe 10, 12,000 of our fellow Russian stock people. The Nazis are running wild there. We call them proto-Nazis or neo-Nazis, but they're followers of Stepan Bandera, and they're really running the roost there. So, Mr. Xi, I don't know how to say this, but I think I may have to invade Ukraine. Now, my notion of how Xi reacted to that was, you mean after the Olympics are over, right? Right, okay. The Olympics are over on the 20th of February. On the 21st of February, Donetsk and Lugansk are recognized as independent countries by Russia. And on the 24th, of course, Russian forces go into Lugansk and Donetsk to defend them and to drive out the neo-Nazis. Now, what does it mean? Well, that was a shock. Nobody expected Xi to approve that. I mean, maybe approve is a little bit too much, but at least he condoned it, because look what he's done since. They've actually supported Russia. They've actually said, look, we think Russia's core interests in Europe are really important, just as important as our core interests vis-a-vis Taiwan. And so what do? We judge each set of circumstances on their own merits. Well, that's a different formulation from the way the Chinese used to put things. They would always say, the Treaty of Westphalia is paramount. That's our cornerstone. No invading other countries. No violation of sovereignty. Blah, blah, blah. Okay? Chinese started not to say that anymore. What they said was, we look at each situation on its own merits, and we have the likings of a military as well as just a very fraternal strategic relationship. Now, that's a long way of setting the stage for the announcement that Biden is going to be meeting with Xi Jinping on Monday. So just right quick from when we speak here. What's he going to do? Well, I think that Xi Jinping is going to say, Mr. Biden, with all due respect, you made fun of my best friend. You insulted my best friend. We Chinese take insults very seriously. You said in your press conference last Wednesday evening that you didn't think we took Putin or the Russians very seriously. You didn't think we were worth much. That you denigrated my best friend Putin. Now, I don't like to see that, so I just wanted to say that in the beginning. Number two, we have this alliance here, and it's really cemented by the lack of statesmanship displayed by this fellow Blinken here and this fellow Sullivan over here. They don't realize? Do they not realize that Russia and China are bound together now against the common enemy? And the common enemy is you, Mr. Biden? If you don't get that, you didn't seem to get it back in June of last year at the summit in Geneva with Putin. We'll get it now, okay? Because if things get out of hand for my best friend Putin in Europe, you're going to see some trouble in the South China Sea or opposite Taiwan. Do you really want to get involved in a two-front war with the two other peer competitors? I don't think so, Mr. Biden. So get rid of these guys. You won't probably say get rid of these advisors, but the implication would be clear. You get it now? These guys misled you a year and a half ago. You ought to understand that what socialist countries, particularly the Russians, the Soviets, used to call the world correlation of forces, okay? I mean, it's a basic concept. It's a balance of power 101, as John Mearsheimer says. The world correlation of forces has changed. How has it changed? Well, Mr. President, this is how it's changed. It used to be, if I can do this, used to be a sort of a triangle, right? Okay. We are Russia, China, and the United States. Now, it's not an equilateral triangle any longer. It's an isosceles triangle. Now, maybe you don't remember your geometry, but an isosceles triangle is two big sides, two big lines, and one in the short that gets the short end of things, literally. You, Mr. President, are on the short end of things, and you don't seem to realize that, but realize it now, because I'm telling you, man to man, if you don't cease and desist coming after both of us, you don't even hide it. You put it in your strategic doctrines. Lastly, Mr. President, I want you to consider something. We Chinese say, why can't we just get along? Why can't we have a win-win situation? Why do you always have to be number one? I mean, not only are you not number one anymore, but you're never going to be number one ever again when you're against China and Russia together. So think about it. Do you have to act like an adolescent boy in making sure you always win the race? The race is pretty much clear now. We're going to be the world's strategic and economic power. Russia is our ally in all but name. Your advisors that say, "Oh well, yeah, it's not a defense alliance, it's not a military alliance." Well, Mr. Biden, that's a distinction without a difference. Don't try us. That's my concept of what President Xi is going to say to Biden. Now, whether it'll get through Biden's head or the heads of his elite advisors, I don't know, because it's really hard to retrain people who have been brought up and educated to think that they're exceptional, that they're indispensable. I think I think that's part of what makes these people do such stupid things. Maybe before I leave this little part here, I'm just gonna 2 weeks ago, Putin gave a really interesting speech at the Valdai conference. Okay, now he said lots of things. He talked for 45 minutes, and then the Q&A, the questions and answers, went for the rest of the 3.5 hours. Now, I don't think the New York Times or the Washington Post reporters hung around to hear the Q&A. They usually don't. They just go back and write something, and then, of course, the editors in New York and Washington write what they want to say. But here's what Putin said about the Chinese thing. It was the penultimate question. It was the next to the last question. So came at 3 hours and 25, okay? But here it is. You have to read these things if you want to know what's going on. He questioned the sanity of those who would, quote, spoil relations with China at the same time as they're supplying billions of weapons to Ukraine to fight against Russia. So is this sane, he says? Here's a quote. He's asked about the growing tensions between China and the United States over Taiwan. And Putin says this, quote, he's referring to Nancy Pelosi's visit, of course, quote, frankly, I do not know why they're doing this. Are they sane? It seems that this runs completely counter to common sense and logic. This is simply crazy. Continuing, it may seem that there is a subtle, profound plot behind this, but I think there is nothing like that. No subtle thought. It is just nonsense and arrogance, nothing else. Such irrational actions are rooted in arrogance and a sense of impunity. Now, arrogance and a sense of impunity is the world in which Blinken and Sullivan and most of the other advisors around Biden grew up. That's what they used to. That's why they talked down to the Chinese way back when, March of last year. That's why they continue to talk down to the Russians. And that's why Biden insulted Putin, referring to his talks with, upcoming talks with Xi, and saying that I don't think Xi takes Putin very seriously. I should probably get exactly what he says in that quote here. What is it? Here it is. Right. Yeah, well, there it is. Here's Biden gratuitously at this press conference Wednesday night. I don't think there's a lot of respect that China has for Russia or Putin. And I don't think they're looking at it as a particular alliance. Matter of fact, they've been sort of keeping their distance a little bit. Huh? So what are his advisors telling him? Well, they're telling him they're interpreting context in completely wrong ways. China says we're against nuclear weapons. Oh, so that's an implicit dig at Russia. Putin says, I understand there's concern in China and everybody else about Ukraine. Oh, so China is concerned. They're how does it say here? They're keeping their distance one from the other. Well, maybe, just maybe, on Monday, after talking with Xi Jinping, who is not inscrutable, he's a pretty up-in-your-face guy, maybe Biden will go to his advisors and say, I thought you told me that Russia was being squeezed by this guy, and he tells me that he's best friends with Putin. What's going on here? Why didn't you tell me that? Now, if that happens, and Biden is able to draw the logical conclusions from this, namely that you don't pick a fight with two major competitors on either side of the world, maybe he'll tuck tail in Ukraine and do the sensible thing by leaning on the Ukrainians to enter negotiations, because it's high time that Ukrainians stop getting killed by the thousands.